Tonight, if you have a newborn, or if you ever will, that baby becomes a legal person the second it takes its first breath. Nobody questions it. Nobody debates it. In the Viking Age, that is not how it worked. A baby could be born alive, healthy, screaming its lungs out, and still not legally exist. For up to 9 days, whether that child got to keep living came down to one decision, made by one person, standing in one room, the father. That is not exaggerated for a thumbnail. That is the literal legal reality historians have reconstructed from Iceland's oldest surviving law books. And that 9-day window is just the opening move. By the end of this video, one of the most repeated facts about how Vikings treated their babies, the one you have probably already heard, is going to fall apart right in front of you. Here's the catch with almost everything in this story. Most of it was not written down during the Viking Age itself. It was written 2, 3, sometimes 400 years later by Christian monks, describing a pagan world they had never actually lived in. Keep that number in your head, because it is going to matter a lot by the end of this video. So picture the actual birth. No doctor, no hospital, no painkillers beyond whatever herbs someone remembered. Just a farmhouse floor, a handful of women, and one person running the entire operation. Someone called a bjargrígur, literally a helping woman. She was not just catching the baby. She was chanting, reciting runes, doing everything short of actual medicine to keep both mother and child alive. Historian Ginny Yakins spent years reconstructing what that labor actually looked like, from scraps buried inside old sagas. Women did not lie back. They knelt. Then, as labor progressed, they shifted onto their knees and elbows, and the baby was caught from behind. No stirrups, no monitors, just the floor and whoever was standing behind you. There is a reason for all that ritual, beyond superstition. A verse from the Sigurdrifumal, an old poem about a legendary shield maiden, specifically references help runes, knowledge you were supposed to have if you wanted to, in its words, loose the child from women. There was an entire category of magical knowledge whose sole purpose was getting a baby out alive. That is how seriously this culture treated the danger sitting in that room. And then the baby was born. This is where it gets dark fast, because at that exact second, that baby had no legal right to exist. The decision belonged entirely to the father. Tradition says the midwife laid the newborn on the ground. If the father picked the child up, that was it, accepted, protected, his. If he did not, the baby could legally be left outside to die. Historians call this exposure. It was not random cruelty scattered across every household. The surviving evidence points mostly to cases of serious birth deformity, or a family that genuinely could not feed one more mouth through the winter. But the fact that this decision point existed at all, built directly into the culture, is something most Viking content skips right past. So how did a baby get out of that limbo? With water. Sometime in the first few days, if the child was accepted, the father sprinkled it with water and gave it a name. It is called Ausavatni, and it was not a religious baptism. Old Norse actually had a completely separate word for that once Christianity showed up, which tells you these were never the same thing in anyone's mind. What Ausavatni did was purely legal. One saga states it almost like a court ruling. Once a child had been sprinkled with water and named, killing it was murder. Before that moment, it was not. A splash of water and a spoken name. That is the entire boundary between zero legal protection and a life the whole community was obligated to defend. And the ceremony came with a gift attached, a ring, a weapon, sometimes land itself, a tradition called Nafnfest, name fastening. In one short ritual, a Viking newborn went from having no legal existence at all to having a name, a bloodline, and a present to mark the occasion. The closest thing the Viking Age had to a birth certificate and a christening gift rolled into one moment. Here is a detail almost nobody brings up. In one saga, a boy named Egil Skallagrimsson is said to have composed his first poem at age 3 and been rewarded with food for it. Historians think that is almost certainly exaggerated, built to set up the legend of a boy who would grow up to be one of the most famous poets and warriors in the sagas. But it tells you something anyway. Even mythologized, this culture thought childhood was worth building a legend around at all. But even a name did not guarantee anything. And here is a story that shows exactly how wrong we can get this, even with real evidence sitting right in front of us.
In 1981, near Roskilde, Denmark, archaeologists opened a grave and found two bodies. A woman, buried with a spear, weighed down by heavy stones. Beside her, a man, neck broken, ankles bound, killed before burial. For almost 40 years, the story wrote itself. An important woman, buried with a sacrificed slave to serve her in death. It became one of the most famous Viking graves ever found. Then, in 2020, someone finally ran DNA on both skeletons. The story collapsed. They were not a noblewoman and a slave, they were mother and son. 4 decades of confident storytelling undone by a single lab result. Keep that in mind because the exact same thing is happening right now in real time to one of the biggest claims about Viking babies. At a cemetery in Sweden called Fjällkinga, used between roughly 900 and 1050 AD, archaeologists excavating in 1990 found something staggering. Of 128 people buried there, 60% were infants and children. Most of those were under a single year old. Read that again, 6 out of every 10 graves belonged to a child, and most of those children never made it to their first birthday. That is not folklore. That is a real excavation report, cross-checked by multiple researchers since. But here is what should genuinely bother you. If infant death was this common, you would expect plenty of graves where a mother and her baby are buried together. Women who died in or right after childbirth, laid to rest with the child who likely caused it. Instead, out of thousands of known Viking burial sites across Scandinavia, researchers have found only 14 likely mother-infant burials. 14 out of thousands. Archaeologist Marianne Hem Eriksson, publishing in 2025, called that number surprisingly few, and she means it. Where did the rest go? Nobody currently has a confirmed answer. This is a real open mystery in Viking archaeology today, not something solved decades ago and just repeated in every documentary since.
And that mystery is exactly where the biggest myth in this whole topic comes from. For decades, one explanation has dominated: that Vikings routinely killed baby girls on purpose. You have probably heard some version of this. It is in documentaries, articles, even textbooks, and it traces back almost entirely to one single academic paper, published in 1988. For over 35 years, that idea just calcified into fact. Then, in December of 2025, printed in February of 2026, so recent it is barely out yet, a researcher named Maren Clara von Mallinckrodt published a direct challenge to the entire narrative. Here is her case. Out of the entire surviving body of Icelandic sagas, only 2 passages actually describe killing a baby girl. 2. That is the textual foundation an entire historical narrative got built on. And it gets worse for the old theory. You genuinely cannot reliably tell whether an infant skeleton is male or female using standard bone analysis. The body has not developed the features scientists need until well after puberty. In Iceland, researchers could not determine sex in 40% of infant skeletons. At one site in Denmark, it was nearly 3 out of every 4. So when older studies confidently labeled buried babies as girls to support the infanticide theory, in a lot of cases, that label was closer to a guess than a measurement. And the simplest explanation of all, a world with no modern medicine, where infant death was already devastatingly common, can explain a cemetery full of dead babies. No killing required. To be fair, this does not mean infanticide never happened. Von Mallinckrodt is not claiming that. A handful of infant remains found in strange places, bogs, wells, abandoned buildings, are still genuinely hard to explain, and she counts only about 4 such cases worth investigating across the entire Viking world. The real fight is not over whether any single case ever happened. It is over whether this was normal, common, socially accepted, the version repeated for decades, or whether that version was built on far less evidence than anyone ever admitted. So back to the question this video opened with. Was a Viking newborn really in danger during those first 9 days? Yes, that part holds up. Acceptance or exposure really was on the table, especially for a child born with serious deformities or into a family already starving. What does not hold up nearly as well is the confident, specific version where healthy baby girls were routinely killed just for being girls. That version is currently being re-examined by the very people whose job it is to know, and right now the field is genuinely split. There are two images worth leaving you with. In the Vinland sagas, a pregnant woman named Freydis Eriksdotter, unable to run from an attack, is said to have grabbed a sword, bared her breast, and struck it with the blade to scare off the men coming for her. And in Sweden, at a site called Aska, archaeologists found a small silver figurine of a pregnant woman wearing what looks like a helmet, the only known piece of Viking Age art that shows pregnancy at all. Researchers have wondered if the two images are echoing each other across centuries. One saga scene and one tiny object, carrying the full weight of an entire experience. Kneeling births on farmhouse floors, water rituals that granted a baby the right to exist, infant graves outnumbering adult ones at some sites, and historians, right now in 2026, still arguing about what any of it actually meant. That is usually how history really works. Not a fact printed once and left alone. A live argument between people staring at the same bones and walking away with different answers. 9 days decided whether a Viking baby got to exist at all. It took historians almost 1,000 years, and they are still not finished, to figure out what actually happened after that.